Hey, and welcome back to the Beats and Bloops Podcast. This is episode 22, working our way towards the end of the season. Just 2 more episodes to go after this one. So, some interesting stuff has been going on this week. We've got a bunch of news to go through here on the top of the hour. I've got some Nerd Crave specific announcements and things like that to make some interesting news on that front, but I want to just introduce everybody and give them their time to shine. We've got the OG crew here, so we've got Pory, Shawn, and Kaz with me tonight. Pory, how's it been going this week?
It's been good. I finally got a new Dippy Egg video out. That's probably my favorite thing I've made so far, and I've just been
the Game Boy camera one.
Game Boy camera, yeah.
I haven't had a chance to watch that, but it is on my TV watched. You know, I just didn't get a chance today.
I think it's the best thing I've made so far, so I'm proud of that.
Definitely looking forward to it.
Yeah, but other than that, I've just been, because on Friday, Pokemon Gen 4 remakes came out. I got both of them, and I started Brilliant Diamond so far. I'm like 7 gyms in, about 15 hours. It's a lot of fun. I'm having a real good time with that.
I bought Brilliant Diamond because I promised myself and Kaz that I would finally give a Pokemon game a real shot, and I opened the case and I put it in the Switch and I downloaded the update, and that's as far as I've gotten. But one of these days I'll get around to it.
Yeah, that one of these days better be in the next couple of days.
And Shawn, how's it going?
Not bad. Not doing a whole bunch, you know. I had some parent-teacher thing where they actually come to your house, so that was kind of interesting today. So I didn't have a lot of time to do any much gaming.
Show them your game collection.
You know, actually, the conversation via horror movies.
I've had similar scenarios. Like there was one time when like this repair guy came to my house like years ago, and he was like, he saw it at NES games, and like we just ended up playing like Excite Bike for like an hour.
I know how those videos end. I've seen those. When a repairman comes to the house, things a little bit friendly. He saw my Friday 13th collection up there and everything, and we got to talking. It's like we were already done talking about the kids and everything. They're boring anyway, so we got talking about that, and that was interesting. Otherwise, I guess I played. A few days ago, I definitely put in a Danganronpa on my PS TV, so that's actually pretty fun. You know.
Tell me a little bit about
their thing, right?
Tell me a little bit about those games, Shawn, because I'm interested in picking up the collection for the Switch.
Visual novels, with a kind of, silly, it's dark story stuff, but it's all kind of told silly and everything, and it's kind of Saw-esque in terms of how things go. Like it's a trap, and people are trapped there, and they go through it. It's fun. I like the story. I'm hoping it gets a little bit harder later, because they basically try to get you to remember what's happened and try to. It's almost like a Phoenix Wright in a way, where you kind of try to put holes in people's stories and figure things out. But they're pretty obvious. First chapter is really, really obvious what was going on. So I hope it gets harder as chapters go on. But it can carry on for quite a long time. Like, can you just end? I want to go to sleep. But they're fun. They're fun enough. Yeah. I have the first.
Wonderful Kaz, how's it going for you today?
Oh, pretty good. I've been playing, just as Pory has, I've been playing a lot of Brilliant Diamond, and I'm only 2 badges in, but I probably put in 13 hours or so as well. I've just been having a lot of fun grinding my Pokemon and like getting all their levels up, and I'm just like doing the whole Nuzlocke thing with it. So it's been tons of fun. And last night I finally started a new adventure module with my D&D group, which I don't know if you guys can really see with the blur, but it's Horde of the Dragon Queen, and it's kind of on topic for our topics tonight that'll be discussed later.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get too far into the news, just to keep you interested, we're going to have a little bit of a spicy discussion tonight about what makes an RPG an RPG, and can you even really use the term RPG for most modern role-playing games these days? So we're going to get into that, but first, a little bit of news on the Nerd Crave front. As many of you know, I have been kind of going through, let's say, a bit of an overhaul of the channel. I've been taking a break. I've made a few community posts on YouTube, just kind of updating people. I put a couple videos up. I did that video at my friend's video game store in Barrie about 3 weeks ago, and that did all right. But I'm completely overhauling everything. I've got a new computer. I just picked up a Mac computer, new monitors. I'm going tomorrow to buy a new camera, new microphones, the whole new, everything, to try and raise the bar of my quality kind of by a factor. We're getting close to that monetization level, and I really want to start taking things a little bit more seriously. So, I'm trying to increase my skills. I've just actually purchased Final Cut Pro for the Apple computer, and I gotta say, I am really impressed with that platform. I'm still learning my way through it, but yeah, a lot of exciting things to come. Shawn's been helping me with a few scripts that I'm planning for the new year. I've got, I think, 4 or 5 scripts in development for the new style of videos that we're going to be putting up, and so keep yourself posted for that. Looking at probably having another video or 2 before Christmas in the old style, and then launching the new stuff right after Christmas and the holidays are over. So getting into some of the news for this week. Some of the biggest news this week, at least for Xbox fans, is that in an event, Xbox announced more than 70 new additions to the backwards compatible list, and this is probably going to be the last set of games that Xbox makes backwards compatible from the OG Xbox and the 360. But there are some pretty interesting additions to the list, as well as a huge list of stuff where they have optimized existing backwards compatible games to have FPS boost and better resolution. Some really notable games, like I'm just looking over here, Neewer, for example. The first Neewer gets FPS boost. The first couple Assassin's Creed games, Darksiders, Fallout New Vegas, Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, Dragon Age Origins, the Dead Space series, a lot of those are getting FPS boost. They're going to look a lot better on the series consoles than they did previously on the Xbox One, even in backwards compatibility. And then, when's the last time you played a Max Payne game? Have you guys played the Max Payne series?
No, I have not.
Most of number 1.
I have 2 of them, but I've never played
them. The entire
them.
Max Payne series is now backwards compatible on the Xbox One and series consoles, and they are supposed to look considerably better than they did back in the day. That kind of gets me a little bit interested because I never played the games, but I was always interested in them. The Fear franchise is now fully available. I think a couple of them were backwards compatible, but now the entire series is available backwards compatible. They completed the Skate franchise by adding Skate 2. So now you can play all of the Skate games on the Xbox. If you have a physical copy that you picked up cheap at a store, you can just pop it right into your Xbox Series X, and of course it downloads a better version of the game. That disc is basically just a license key, but it's pretty cool that you can go buy a used game from 2 or 3 generations ago, pop it in your machine, and play the damn thing. That's pretty cool. I don't know. I really appreciate what Xbox has been doing with their dedication to backwards compatibility, even though it's not complete. There's a lot of games that have licensing issues and stuff like that, so they're never going to all be backwards compatible, but I think it's pretty cool what they're doing. What do you guys think?
I don't know. I have my own consoles. I don't really need it. If it's not full backwards compatibility, I don't really care.
The great thing about it, though, is you have the old consoles, but now you can play these games on a new console with higher frame rates, higher resolution, and an HDMI solution.
Well,
The problem, they all PS3 and Xbox 360 had HDMI, but here's my thing: if it's not fully backwards compatible, like with all your games, then you got to have your old system on anyway. The big thing about backwards compatibility isn't even the upgrades or advancements; it's not having as many systems hooked up. I have my Retron 5, so I don't have to have my Nintendo and Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis and everything hooked up. If only a third of the games are available, I still need my Xbox 360 plugged in. I would like to have
they have made the most popular games available for the most part. So
not Halo.
Theoretically, most of the games that you would want to play are there, and you could pack up your 360 for the most part and just take it out when there's that one specific game you need.
I don't know if Beautiful Katamari is on there, but that Automodius, I don't know if we're kind of talking about the other week about
I have that game as well. I don't believe that's backwards compatible, but Katamari, I believe, was one of the ones that was. I'm just looking at the list here.
It might be.
That's one of the ones.
Katamari's a pretty popular game.
Yeah, Beautiful Katamari is now backwards compatible.
Okay, but still, I mean, if it just seems weird. Like I have to check. Plus, half of my Xbox 360 collection is Kinect games, and none of those are backwards compatible. So, in fact, that's the main reason I have a 360 is for the backwards or for the Kinect games, because I like the uniqueness of them, and that can't work. But whatever. I mean, I appreciate what they're doing. It's better than what the PS4 did. The PS4 did nothing. So, I mean, something's better than nothing. I'm just saying it doesn't really matter a lot to me.
Say what you will about Activision, but back in the day, Activision was putting out some pretty good games with the Call of Duty franchise back in the OG Xbox and the Xbox 360 days. That was kind of the glory days in that Black Ops 2, Modern Warfare,
True Crime, Streets of LA.
Some of those games were fantastic, and they are now all backwards compatible. All the Call of Duty games from the original Xbox and the Xbox 360 are now fully backwards compatible with FPS boost and resolution boost. So that's pretty cool because honestly, for me, I'm a big fan of those older Call of Duty games, your Modern Warfare 2 and 3 and stuff like that. I love to go back and play those games, couch co-op with my friends. They're way better than the new ones as far as I'm concerned.
What about Halo 1 and 2? Are they backwards compatible?
All the Halo games and all the Gears of War games are all
now? Because they weren't before. Halo 1 and 2 were not.
Yeah,
I think that was
one they do.
That was intentional, I think, because they released their remastered set. So I think they would have like, no, we're not going to make these ones available because we want you to buy the new ones.
That you may be right about that. I don't see that on the new list, but
I think by now they would
have, as far as performance and visuals, you'd be better off with the Master Chief Collection anyway.
I don't care about performance and visuals. In fact, a lot of times games weren't designed for these super smooth 60 frames per second. It's like movies. Movies could be at a lot higher frames per second too, but they don't because there's a stylistic choice there. And when you have games based on and made for and around a certain frames per second, sure, it looks smoother, but it looks faker. It looks more unreal, looks more uncanny valley thing. And when you increase the frame rate for a movie, suddenly it looks like a daytime soap opera, right? There's that sort of
I remember seeing that first Hobbit movie when what's his name? He launched it in what was it, like 90 frames a second or something like that it was launched at, and I watched it, and that was a bizarre experience, man.
Yeah,
it was unsettling. It almost made me feel sick.
Yeah, so I mean, like I play these new games. Like when you have an HD remake of a game, it looks really pretty, really sharp. But it's like also wrong. So I don't really care about that. If anything, I'd want them to make it so it looks like it did, because when you take a PS2 and hook up to a TV, it doesn't look very good. Like a modern HD TV, you got to play it on a CRT for that real sharpness. If they could bring the sharpness back without making us see every little pixel somehow, like have some sort of like a extra filter over it or something, kind of like the scanline filters on retro gaming consoles. That'd be nice. I don't need you to fix everything. If you can do a whole remaster where you or a remake where you change everything like Spyro or Crash Bandicoot, that's fine because you're changing everything. When you're taking the old source and just painting over it, it doesn't always look right. GTA, trilogy remastered.
So we are in the lead up to Black Friday. We're in Black Friday week now. Most of the major gaming retailers have got deals going on right now. And as you would expect, there are some pretty amazing deals. Now, I didn't bother to go to individual retailers and get you exact prices here, because your mileage is going to vary depending on what country you're in and what access to which retailers you have. But I have noticed a trend amongst all the retailers in the States and Canada, whether that be Walmart, Best Buy, GameStop, Target. They all have a lot of really similar things on sale for pretty similar prices right now. And there's some stuff that you should definitely keep your eyes open for if you've been waiting for some deals. So I've noticed that there are a ton of major Nintendo releases on sale at all these different retailers for prices ranging from $35 to $50, depending on your currency. Breath of the Wild is available, I believe, at Target for about $45, brand new. Paper Mario I have seen in Canada. At GameStop, it's available for, I believe it's $55, which would probably be about $40-$45 in the States. Monster Hunter Rise is actually on sale on Black Friday only, I believe, for $25 at Best Buy, I believe it is. And it's also on sale for $30 and $40 in a couple of other places as well. But Monster Hunter Rise just came out this year. It's probably the best looking game that's ever been on the Switch. Even if you're not a Monster Hunter fan, it's probably something that at $25 is worth picking up and checking out. You could probably trade it back in for at least that $25 at a game store if you didn't like it after Black Friday. So the Tony Hawk Remastered that came out, was that the end of last year or early? I think it was Christmas time last year or something that came out.
It's Christmas time last year.
Yeah, it's I'm seeing it floating around for $20 US, $30 in Canada. That's a pretty good price. That is a good port on the Switch. Everybody says that it runs really good on the Switch. The Spyro trilogy I have seen floating around in the $20 price point in the US. And then PS5 games, quite a few PS5 games I have seen on sale, including Spider-Man Miles Morales, Returnal, and Deathloop. I've seen them all in the $20 to $30 off price range at multiple retailers. So if you have a PS5, it might be time to stock up on Christmas presents. But yeah, some pretty good deals. I personally picked up Burnout Paradise Remastered today for $25 Canadian, which is under $20 US. So I felt like that was a pretty good time to buy into that game, because if you're a fan of semi-realistic looking racing games and you have a Switch, there's not many to choose from besides the one Need for Speed game, I think, Most Wanted, that's on the Switch, and Burnout Paradise. That's pretty much it in terms of realistic graphics racing games. So I'm definitely looking forward to getting into that as we go along. Guys, have you seen any deals out there as far as big Black Friday stuff that you want to let people know about?
Yeah, I mean,
looking honestly.
I don't know. Stocks might be limited, but yesterday I got Paper Mario Origami King for $26 on Amazon. They had a few other games that were going for that as well. There's like I forget what it was. I want to say maybe Astral Chain was one of them, and there was a few of them, and they were like
mentioned in the sale, but I don't remember what the price was.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of Switch games that are like $26 or some that are like like 30 something. Like there's a lot of really cheap ones on Amazon.
Now keep in mind that's 50 Canadian. So that's pretty much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so it's like a good deal.
That is a good game. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah. I guess our last big piece of news here, and maybe not such a big piece of news for you guys, but it's a good time to be an Xbox fan right now with the the new Halo game coming out, the multiplayer. They're calling it a beta right now, but the game's out. It's just out. And from all the reports out there, from all the major YouTubers that I follow, everybody is saying that the Halo multiplayer is fantastic. There are virtually no real glitches or anything like that. The game is pretty polished. And most people are saying, because a lot of people, Halo fans, did not really like Halo 4 or Halo 5. They felt like Halo 5 went too much down the road of Call of Duty and kind of didn't feel like a Halo game anymore. But everybody is saying that this new Halo multiplayer that is free to play, you don't even have to have Game Pass. You can download this without even having Game Pass and play it for absolutely free on an Xbox One or an Xbox Series.
The multiplayer, right?
Multiplayer only, online multiplayer only. That's what most people want to play these days. The story missions are coming out, like the campaign and the physical version of the game is coming out, I believe, December 8th. But the multiplayer launched, a couple weeks early. They're calling it a beta, but it seems like everything is running really well. I heard something yesterday about over 1 million concurrent players at the same time. People are really enjoying it.
Now, if that was in the same game,
pardon?
That'd be impressive. If that was 1 million players in the same game, that'd be great.
In the same match, you mean?
Yeah.
Halo multiplayer is usually set up in little squad-based things. You'll have like 2-on-2 or 4-on-4 or 8-on-8 or something like that. The matches are usually fairly small in terms of number of players. Excuse me. But in other Xbox news, Forza Horizon 5, which is one of the most anticipated Xbox games next to Halo, Forza, Gears of War, and Halo being Microsoft's 3 biggest franchises, having 2 of them launch just before the holidays is going to be a really big seller for Microsoft. Forza Horizon 5 looks to be absolutely fantastic, and every report that I've seen about this game is that unlike so many games these days that launch unfinished and buggy, and they need day one patches, and they need a whole roadmap of updates and bug fixes and hot fixes and stuff just to make the game playable. Looking at you, Cyberpunk 2077, and the new Grand Theft Auto Trilogy Remastered, which are just complete hot messes. Forza Horizon 5 looks like it has launched in a perfectly finished condition, and people are just raving about how fantastic it is. Apparently, including the Game Pass numbers, we had something like 10 million downloads or 10 million people playing this game in the first week, which is huge. I mean, Game Pass, of course, makes these things a lot more accessible, excuse me, than it would be buying a $70 game or whatever. But that's pretty impressive. Like, it's a lot of people are asking why this wasn't included in the Game of the Year conversation. And we should maybe get into a little bit of a talk about Game of the Year. We sort of mentioned that last week a little bit as well. But, I kind of wonder why, racing games always seem to get the snub. Would you guys ever consider any racing game to be the best game for you in a year?
No.
I just don't play that many racing games. But that's kind of what Game of the Year is supposed to be, is like everybody's favorite game from that year. And racing games aren't in everybody's genre. Animal Crossing was, the time that it released when everybody had time to play it.
Yeah, but 10 million people played the game in the first week. Like, that's a lot of people.
That is a lot of people, and that's fantastic. But there's billions of gamers. 10 million out of billions is not actually that much.
Yeah.
And how long did they play it, and how much did they care? And a game like that's almost like an in between your big boy games. They're fun. I love racing games too, but they never take over my gaming. There's something I play between games, because you play a race here and there. And honestly, there's never really a lot of content. You might get a lot of cars, a lot of tracks, but it's kind of just more of a variations of each car, just different numbers.
You're
not really getting
Horizon 5 basically a racing RPG now, because you've got, and that kind of feeds into our topic for later tonight, but
whatever an RPG
you've got RPG elements in the game with like experience points and unlocking, car upgrades and all of this kind of stuff. Plus your driver stats increase and you get better licenses as you go and access to more content based on your experience points and that sort of thing. So it's kind of interesting, and we'll talk about that a little bit more here. We're pretty much done with the news. What time have we got here? Yeah, we're pretty much coming up on the break. Any comments on the news before we take a break, guys? I'll take that as a no.
No!
Well, why don't we take a quick break here, and we'll come back in 5 minutes if you're on Twitch, and for the rest of you out there, we will be right back. All right, welcome back. We've all potentially emptied our bladders and filled our coffee cups and whatever, but at least I have. So we're going to get into our main topic for tonight, which is defining, hopefully, what an RPG is, or if you can even really use the term RPG anymore in the modern era of gaming. But before we dive into that, I just had one more piece of Nerd Crave news, which may help you out there this holiday season if you're looking for Switch accessories. Now, some of you actually accessories for all major systems, but I mostly go for the Switch accessories. Some of you may know I have had a relationship with Oivo Games for over a year now. I've made several reviews of their products. They have sent me some products for free for review, and some of their products I have purchased of my own and reviewed them and mentioned them on the podcast and things like that. I really enjoy, they're a Chinese company. I mean, don't get me wrong, a lot of their stuff is kind of what you would expect to see on AliExpress or something like that. But I have compared several of their products to the more expensive versions of them. Something like this, for example, which is their asymmetrical Switch OLED grip. It's got a nice little stand here. It has slots for several, like 5 games in the back, and the slots hold on pretty good. It slides in really good. It's got rubber kind of slides inside so you don't scratch the Switch when you're putting it on and off. And something like this, if you were to go and buy the most popular Switch grip out there, that is from SatisFi, the SatisFi grip here in Canada is going to cost you about $45 plus shipping to get it here to Canada. And don't get me wrong, the SatisFi grip is excellent. But this is everything you would need a SatisFi grip to be. It is comfortable. It's about the same ergonomics overall as the SatisFi grip. And this grip, which I purchased myself as soon as I got the OLED, was $16.99 on their website, and free shipping if you get it from Amazon and from their website. And, I'm pretty happy with it. Is the SatisFi grip maybe a little bit nicer? Maybe, but like 2% different. Like, it's really everything you would want it to be for a third of the price. So that is why I've been working with Oivo for so long. And just recently this week, they offered me something called a brand ambassadorship, which allows me to offer you, the viewers, a special link, a Nerd Crave link, where you can go directly to their website. Now, this link doesn't work on Amazon currently, but I'm working on that. But if you go directly to their website, you can get some excellent deals. It does take a little bit longer for them to ship it directly from China or wherever their warehouses are. But, I got this Switch grip in about probably 8 to 10 business days. And for the savings, I think it's worth the wait. So right now, if you go to oivogames.com, you can browse the website. You can purchase anything on the website, not just Switch stuff. They have things like replacement batteries for Xbox controllers with a charging dock. They have stuff like stands where you can stand up the Switch and put Joy-Cons on it and hang headphones and things like that. They have cooling fan stands for your PS5 that also have PS5 controller mounts and like all kinds of accessories, like everything you could think of. And anything on the website, if you type in the discount code NerdCrave20 as you're checking out, you will save 20% off of everything, not just one item, but as much stuff as you want to buy. And by doing that and using that link, you will support Nerd Crave a little bit. It doesn't give me a whole lot of money, but it's nice to be able to have that give and take. So if you're looking for Christmas presents for the gamer in your family and you start now, you can probably get this stuff in with lots of time to spare before Christmas. So do me a favor and do them a favor. Check it out. Use that code discount NerdCrave20 and happy holidays.
And now
Anyways,
back
guys,
to your regularly scheduled.
say that again.
And now back to your regular scheduled program.
Yeah. So what the hell is an RPG, Shawn?
Well, before I tell you what I think an RPG is, I just want to let people know that though I butcher the language often enough, and that's bad, I do believe that words have meaning, and that changing them based on emotion is bad and dangerous and makes us all unable, butchering, to be able to communicate the language to each other. For instance, the biggest pet peeve is how everyone for years now argues, is this retro? Is this retro? Is this retro? Is this retro? It's like, no, it's not. The Retron 5 is retro. The PlayStation Classic, the NES Mini, and those are retro, because retro means now, but like the old days. You can be a retro gamer because you play games like you would in the old days. But those old games, they're just old games. They're not retro games. They were made for them. They're just old, But everyone uses the word wrong. And for years, we've had people arguing and fussing and yelling and losing friendships over what the word retro is, when all of them are using it wrong. So RPGs. I do like etymology, which is the origin of words. And I think a lot of people probably know what RPG means, although...
So wait, we're not talking about the type of gun?
Yes, well, that's the thing, right? When Doom came out, that was when the term RPG was really heavily used for video games, right? And it was very easy to understand what people were talking about sometimes. But Doom, yeah, you got RPG. It was always a big funny thing because it's like, because I'm using Final Fantasy against the cacodemons. But it does mean role-playing game for those who don't know, right? And the origin of role-playing game for video games comes from tabletop games, right? So Zach is currently diving into the world of Dungeons and Dragons. And I don't know if you're dabbling in other tabletop role-playing sort of thing, but those are role-playing games because you take on the role of usually one character and you talk about every aspect of that character. You control what they say, how often they bathe, their haircut, everything, like everything. There's obviously rules in those games. They're not just randomized, and those rules are interpreted by the dungeon master because it's all human run. It's very organic, and you can do what you want, and it feels like you're really taking on the role. Now, some will use the argument that every video game is a role-playing game because you're taking on the role. I don't like that either because I don't think you really are in any video game, because you are influencing a character in a game. You're not really taking on the role of a character. You're influencing a character. Maybe choose between a couple lines he says. Maybe you choose which direction he goes in, right? Because I don't think any of us would really go so far to say a choose your own adventure book is an RPG. You are taking on the role, you are making decisions, but really, I don't think it's an RPG. And I think video games...
Let me interrupt there, Shawn, for a second. That really makes sense. I hadn't really thought of that. I had said, and Pory said the same thing too, like any game could be a role-playing game because you're taking on the role of the character, but you're really not. You're right. You're influencing, you're controlling a character. It's external to you. Whereas when you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, you are internalizing that. You are bringing the options into yourself and then expressing yourself into that character, and you are the character. The character wouldn't exist without your imagination.
Right, and that's how actors do. The actors are role-playing because they are taking on a role and they're making it their own, and they control every aspect of it. They're still following a script, but so why did we use the term role-playing game for video games? Well, because we stole it from the role-playing gamers, right? The early RPGs were just rip-offs of Dungeons and Dragons. Almost every RPG was fantasy-based. all of them basically had the same thing. You're fighting dragons, be it Dragon Warrior or Final Fantasy, the two big early RPGs. But even early RPGs were Dungeons and Dragons on television, right? But then people call them role RPGs because they had RPG elements, and that's and that's a tricky term too. Like even how you define the elements. And so I go back to the big RPG, Dungeons and Dragons. They have experience points. They have exploration. They have equipment choices, and you get to go to towns and talk to people, go on quests. And a lot of those features carry over to early RPGs and video games. Now, there's other role-playing tabletop games that don't have experience points, that don't have those kind of rules, and it's more of just a really complex choose-your-own-adventure that's guided by the game master or dungeon master, whatever you want to call them. So I don't think RPG should even be a term we use anymore. I think we should just focus on talking about what elements are being used. Like, so this is a racing game with an experience system. Why are we saying RPG elements? Just say experience system. I don't see why we have to go RPG.
People
easier.
Emotionally, never having played any of those tabletop games back in the day or even currently, my first experience with something called an RPG was a video game RPG, the likes of Final Fantasy. One of the first RPGs I ever really played. Well, the two I never played RPGs back in the NES and Super NES days. The first two RPGs that I ever played were Parasite Eve and Final Fantasy VII, and that set the high watermark for what I expect out of an RPG in terms of mechanics and things of that nature. So that vibe is to me what RPG means, and I think it has a lot to do with your personal experience. Even though the word has a very specific meaning, and we're going to try and define some of the characteristics that actually contribute to what an RPG is in a game. But it's funny that, say, I'd be interested to hear from you, Kaz, with your experience with Dungeons and Dragons. What does role-playing game mean to you in that context that maybe you don't see in a video game?
So there's a lot that Shawn said that I agree with, to put it first.
All of what Shawn said is what you should
most. And it's good to disagree, right? So there's a lot of core aspects to what makes a tabletop RPG, specifically a role-playing game where you're taking on your character, you're exploring, going on quests, whatever. And I mean, my first real RPG experience, a little bit of Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, but then primarily Elder Scrolls 5 Skyrim. And you really are taking on the role of this character and controlling everything that this person that you've created does, eats, sleeps, attacks something, doesn't attack something. Sure, generally you're only picking out of a few voice lines or something that he might say in response. And it's in that aspect closer to a choose your own adventure book, but you're still making the decisions whether or not you want to follow through this quest. You're still making the decision yourself. This is your persona in the world of Skyrim or whatever. And that's very similar to a game like Dungeons and Dragons, where you have all these different pillars, but it's just because it's a video game, they don't have the flexibility because it's not a human brain able to give that organic feel, and they have to sort of dumb it down. But yeah, it's the same in Dungeons and Dragons and a lot of other tabletop role-playing games. You have that exploration pillar. There's like the 4 pillars is the exploration, the combat, the social. Actually, I guess 3 pillars. The 3 pillars of that. And you can experience that in a lot of what we call to be like the Western RPGs. And so like that's kind of how I see it. If we look at early ones, even like Elder Scrolls Arena, it's very much just a computerized D&D. Like it's literally the stats spread, strength, intelligence, wisdom, charisma, whatever. It's the same thing pretty much. So it's
Pory. Setting aside Shawn's argument as far as the etymology of the word goes, and we'll circle back to that, but I really want to dive into, what we call RPGs, whether that terminology is right or wrong. There is an established icon of what an RPG is, and that's usually, if you look at, if you ask a normie, so to speak, somebody who is not really into the gaming scene, if you were to ask a gamer's mom to name an RPG, they might name something like Final Fantasy as being just a very recognized name. But I'm curious, what would be a couple of games for you, Pory, that you say would really define like the absolute core of what you think like an RPG really is?
Well, I feel like there's not just one answer to that. Like, there's all sorts of different kinds of RPGs that I play. Like, Pokemon, Dragon Quest, Skyrim, like they're all very different experiences, but I would consider all of them RPGs. It's like, like, so, and you mentioned off video, like, how some are like JRPGs, some are US RPGs. And I mean, that's not just limited to the RPG world, like platformers. Like, you can definitely tell when you're playing like a British made platformer, like if you're playing like an old like British PC platformer game, like you can tell it's like a British. So it's not just limited to RPGs. Like they're just kind of, there's more than one style, and I don't know if I could really restrict it to just one thing.
And that kind of brings us back to the etymology sort of idea that Shawn's talking about, because if there are so many different things that equal an RPG, can they all really be called RPGs, or do we really need to focus down? Like when you look at something like Fire Emblem being a strategy RPG, for example, could we have a better name for that? Because the Fire Emblem is very different from, say, the Final Fantasy VII remake that's an action RPG, and like everything is different. Like even the math, the algorithms that run the game are completely different in terms of, I was talking to Shawn last night about, for me, an RPG has to be pretty mathematically based. So you look at something like, the dice roll sort of scenario that needs to be programmed in there. So in Fire Emblem, when you attack a character, you don't know whether you're going to do 30 damage or 90 damage, or whether you're going to miss, or whether you're going to get a critical hit and an insta-kill. There's a dice roll mechanic there, and there's all kinds of math going on in the background behind what you see behind the scenes in the games. And I think that's, for me, pretty important, a pretty key aspect of what I would call an RPG, is having that like mathematical system where you've got all these attributes, similar to Dungeons and Dragons, where you have 2 points in attack and 3 points in defense, and a certain amount of luck and a certain amount of charisma, and all of those things play into the algorithm and affect your attack power or affect your defense power or whatever. And that's a pretty staple thing for RPGs for how I would define them. But I'm curious, what would maybe be some core mechanics that you would associate with an RPG?
Like
Let
me.
you guys go first, yeah.
Okay. So core mechanics for me is story, and like, yes, there are a lot of books, visual novel games. I'm not really talking about those, but where you're sort of taking the role, like there's even the Western RPG versus JRPG is sort of something Pory was touching on there. Both of them, you're going through some form of story, whether it's your own more sandbox open world story like Skyrim, or like Final Fantasy, where it's more of a written out story, but you're following a set of characters along their path, sort of helping them, guiding them, make their decisions, whatever. But in the, sort of circling with the D&D stuff, a lot of homebrew games, or like games where there's no module associated to them, people are creating their own world, are more sandbox style, like Skyrim. You just kind of go around, do what you want, find monsters, kill them, help out townsfolk, whatever. But then you have the modules that are like pre-written adventures, like one I'm just about to run for my group called Horde of the Dragon Queen here. And that's it's a very linear adventure where this party gets together and they follow set plot points, and they're just kind of playing the roles, but they still have to follow the plot points to finish the adventure, to do everything quote unquote properly. They can make other decisions, they can go completely off rails, which is something that video games don't allow for as easily, but it's still that role-playing section. So that's, as long as you're sort of in that, you've got that party mindset, you're playing with different characters, but you've got your core party sort of thing, and you're following this whole expansive story, typically 80-hour long video games. That's, to me, that's what sort of makes up an RPG, the role-playing game. You're playing the role of someone in this party.
So Shawn, pick a super popular role-playing video game and tell me why it's not a role-playing game.
Well, let's take Final Fantasy 13. It's popular in one way or another. Okay, I mean, it's got your story, but if you took the story out of that, or even if you took the story out of Elder Scrolls 5 Skyrim, you could still have the exact same game that's just as good, and it would still be an RPG without a story, right? I think a lot of people didn't like Legend of Mana because there's not really a whole bunch of story there, right? It's kind of a loose, kind of thrown together thing. That's why people hated it back then. Maybe people are easier now. So with Final Fantasy 13, I mean, it's a very popular game. You control these characters, you decide what to do, but then you don't have control because characters just come and go from the party out of your control. You have no decision on what happens in the story. All you're doing is witnessing the story. You're choosing what equipment to put on these characters and how they grow, and you're walking down these linear corridors, going on these little nodes, getting things.
Okay,
it's still an RPG, isn't it?
But then if we play something like Dungeons and Dragons, and you get a really bad dungeon master who railroads the players, and they're not allowed to make their own decisions. They just have to witness the story. Is it not an RPG then because the dungeon master was just doing a bad job? Or is that just a poorly executed RPG then in Final Fantasy 13?
Okay, so I'm going to go back a step and go back to pre-video games, okay? The reason why they're called tabletop RPG games is because you are role-playing, right? Snakes and Ladders is a board game. There's board games, RPG games. I don't know what you call Barrel of Monkeys, like a skill game, right? That's why there's different genres there, and it's very easy to differentiate, right? Because in Snakes and Ladders, you generally aren't, although you could do it, you generally aren't role-playing. You're not like, okay, my adventurer looks at the die and agrees to the rules to follow and move only 2 spaces. Oh, he fights the snake, but he's, whatever. You could role-play it.
That's how I play it.
You know what? We should totally do that sometime as like a total joke stream or something. I'd do that.
So I mean, there is genre mashups, and that's one of the reasons why I think this is a topic for video games, is everything's mashed up so much that even if RPG did have a place in naming, it's not there anymore. So yeah, I mean, if the dungeon master is making bad decisions, it's a really bad game. It's a really bad role-playing game, but yeah, it's still a role-playing game because the players are taking on the role, right? They are the how they play is role-playing. That is the crux of it. Yes. Pory.
I have a very weird question, and it wouldn't be a Pory time without me referencing something really obscure. The Magnavox Odyssey 2 RPG video game hybrids, are those RPGs to you?
Wow, that is obscure. Are the Magnavox 2 RPG hybrids like
Magnavox Odyssey 2? It had 3 games on it that were like tabletop RPGs, but like there was a cartridge you put in it to like do like mini games and stuff.
I don't.
I saw, God, who was it that was doing a video on those? John Hancock was talking about those, and they actually look super fun because it's like a hybrid between the tabletop game with like almost like the video game console being the Dungeon Master.
Yeah.
So
I have 2 of the 3. They're neat.
I guess that would be the same question: is would VCR Clue be a video game? Right? I mean, it depends like what that's doing. I don't know enough about it to say. I mean, in the end, I mean, you can call anything an RPG, really. I mean, name it what you want, right? I mean, although I would say it is a interpretation of a role-playing game, a video game interpretation. But if you actually are role-playing and just using the game as a dungeon master of sorts, because there's single-player role-playing games out there, like tabletop role-playing games. Yeah. So if that would be a way to augment your singular multiplayer experience without an actual dungeon master, then sure. I mean, there's always mashups that you can do things like that. Look at the Mario Party E we discussed last week. That is a card game, but it uses the video game system augment the game. So it's a Mario Party card game, video game. You can play it without the video game aspect of it too. Same with the toy game for the PS3. I Have Judgment. It's a card game made by Wizards of the Coast, so it's kind of like Magic the Gathering. You can play it without the video game, but the video game is nice and augments it. It lets the characters battle on screen, but you don't need it. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's something similar. I don't know enough to really say, but
Yeah.
So, but all these things we call elements of role-playing games, right? Maybe it's experience points. Maybe it's the random number generator. Maybe it's exploration. Maybe it's controlling what your characters do. But every single game you can name has at least one of those elements, even dating back to almost whatever. So is there a certain number of those elements that need to be present to make it a role-playing game? Is it 5 elements? Does it have to have experience?
Well, I think it's got to have the three pillars: that social, that exploration, and the combat.
Social meaning.
I mean, even in the even in the simplistic way that we see in things like single player games like Skyrim, where it's just a few text choices, or going into a shop and buying your items, or whatever, having that, but not necessarily the experience points, not necessarily the the skill trees, but having those 3 combat.
So what about a dungeon crawler that doesn't have a social element? You just are an adventurer who goes into a dungeon.
Well, then it's a dungeon crawling game. It's
but it's not an RPG dungeon crawler. I mean, they are
people would call dungeon crawlers a type of RPG, though.
They might call it a type of RPG, but we go and we say, oh, this is a dungeon crawler, right? We play Diablo and we say, well, that's a dungeon crawler.
But it's also an RPG.
It is also an RPG, but we go and we call it dungeon crawler. Like Call of Duty has RPG elements, but we call it a first-person shooter because it's mainly that action first-person shooting genre. It has some experience stuff, but that's about it. It doesn't have all the exploration and whatnot.
Right.
So if we were to make a set of rules today, in today's landscape, looking at the history of what we call RPGs and looking at the current situation of, like, literally every game that comes out seems to have RPG elements these days. Like, even farming games are, generally RPG these days, and racing games can have RPG elements. Any simulation game to some degree is an RPG because you're simulating something, like, 2 Point Hospital that I've talked about before, where you're building and managing a hospital and then a network of hospitals, and as you level up, you get access to more stuff and you make money, and then you put that money back into growing the hospital some more. And, like, even something like that could be considered an RPG. So where do we draw the line?
I just want to ask again, what are those 3 pillars?
Social, combat, and exploration. And I would honestly, at first, this rule set, I would add a character development where you're either developing your own character or a party of characters in a JRPG.
So this is where there's been confusion about what an RPG is from the beginning. People from the beginning called Zelda an RPG, although in the circles I grew up in, that was a quest game. That was an adventure game, and Final Fantasy is called Quest. Because I remember before, in my area, my small towns, we didn't use the term RPG. Final Fantasy was a quest game. Zelda was an adventure, but people mix up those terms because Zelda has character through the items that you wear and the tools you use.
I would honestly 100% say yes. The Zelda games tend to be more RPG based games.
Mm-hmm. See, but that's where it gets so weird because Zelda and Final Fantasy are so completely different from one another that using that term RPG then becomes meaningless.
I would not call Zelda an RPG because Zelda is much closer to an adventure game like Uncharted or God of War than it is to Final Fantasy. It's an adventure game that has some similarities to an RPG, but you don't have an experience mechanic. You don't have a mechanic where your character gets stronger necessarily. You get hearts and stamina, but you get better gear
throughout the game.
You
And
earn that stuff
there
by
are-
finding it in the environment. Your character doesn't just naturally get more powerful.
But there are some tabletop RPGs, which is what we're sort of basing this off of, where you don't have experience and your character gets stronger. You just gain better gear.
Yeah.
And it's very similar.
See,
Yeah,
that's
what I'm playing now
that's
does
another
not
element.
experience.
See, people want to say that experience would be an element of an RPG, but it isn't all the time, right?
Yeah.
Or if it is, it's not always major. Like I was mentioning Final Fantasy VIII, you do gain experience, but it actually is harmful to you because the monsters grow at the same rate. And there's people that will play the game and almost Final Fantasy VIII is almost breakable because if you minimize and never gain levels, you can actually just kind of break the game by getting the better tools and equipment while avoiding fights and just getting your magic junction onto your thing. So experience isn't always something that we do. It's a very lazy, I think.
You know, I hate to beat a dead horse mentioning Kitaria Fables again, but Kitaria Fables calls itself an RPG, and it has ARPG combat, and you have that gameplay loop of going out and killing enemies and then coming back to your home base and doing whatever upgrades and things like that. But you don't gain any experience for killing monsters at all. There is no experience system whatever in the game. Instead, you harvest monster parts after you kill them, and you come back and craft better equipment and that sort of thing. So, is that an RPG or isn't it?
Well, it sounds like it is.
If I were to use the term RPG, I certainly would. I don't like to use the term, but if I do, yeah, that fits. Here's the thing. Almost every other medium, regular games like, physical games, books, movies, music, genres work because they're not as complex, honestly. And you can mash genres like Shaun of the Dead is a comedy horror, right? That's pretty basic. It's not complex. It's a comedy, it's a horror, it's a perfect mashup 50-50. Video games are so much more complex because they incorporate almost every art form you can imagine, and it gets your interactivity complicates things so much. Like when we were talking about racing games, you can't just say it's a racing game. You have to say, is it an arcade racing game? Is it a simulation racing game? Is there RPG elements? Is there an adventure mode like in Diddy Kong Racing? You can't just slap a genre on a video game and call it a day. In the early 70s, late 70s, early 80s, sure, you've got your shooters, but you can't call anything a shooter anymore, right? I mean, Fallout 3, it's a shooter, but it's primarily an RPG, or is it primarily a shooter? Depends how you play it, right? You can play it without getting into the VAT system and just go bang, 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 and boom. You just play through it basic and call it a shooter with RPG elements, or it's an RPG with shooter elements. It depends on how you play, and it changes the genre, right?
Yeah.
Mario can be an RPG, like which power up am I going to select? It could have the fire weapon equipped, or it could have the raccoon weapon equipped. I get to choose the path I go down. Should I take on that enemy monster in that castle, or should I bypass to search the secret weapon in the lands of behind the scene? And you can role play it in your head if you want to as well. You got the social element of talking to the king or working together with another player. Is it an RPG? I wouldn't say so. There's combat, there's social, there's exploration. But I wouldn't call it an RPG.
Is there really social in the Mario games?
When you're working, it's a social. And when it comes to, when you talk about Mario Odyssey, I'd say there is, because you're talking.
Yes.
But that's not, I wouldn't call that an RPG in the slightest, or even say there's RPG elements, but it does have the social. It fits all the criteria.
That's true.
And when you're playing Mario 3, I mean, when you're playing with another player, yeah, I mean, it's not video game presented social, but it is you discussing, okay, you take that path, I take that path, let's conquer this together. There's that social. I mean, there is kings talking to you and stuff, even though it doesn't really have any bearing on too much. Depends on how you look at that. But there's so much, like racing games have arcade or simulation, and shooters. I mean, wow, there's side-scrolling shooters, vertical shooters, static screen shooters, multi-screen shooters, scrolling shooters, first-person shooters, RPG shooters, online shooters, wave shooters. We got your MOBAs, and you got your, wave. It's just so much. Touch-based shooters, infinite shooters. You can't just use the word shooter. And the word shooter, no one calls a game a shooter anymore. No one says shooter. It's always something else with it. And I think the term RPG is equally as complex, and you can't use it anymore. And since an RPG doesn't have a really set definition anyway, because it can have any elements, story, experience, anything, it's just best in this day and age to just describe what a game has. Final Fantasy Tactics is a grid-based, turn-based strategy game. That's
to be fair though, like when describing RPGs, a lot of the time they do it that way, like an action RPG, a JRPG, a tactical RPG, strategy RPG. Like they do describe them as such. Like I don't ever hear anybody talking about like Fire Emblem and going up maybe like it's an RPG. Usually it's like, oh, it's a like strategy RPG.
But how often these days you hear anyone say it's an RPG without slapping on another label or two or three? Right?
Never.
Yeah, exactly.
Almost never. Yeah.
Exactly. And how do you different? And when you say Western versus Japanese, you're talking about location because there's generally a different style. But when you look at Secret of Evermore versus Secret of Mana, is one a JRPG and the other one, a J action RPG and the other one's a Western action RPG, even though they're nearly identical in most aspects. I mean, you wouldn't really separate it between
Japanese JRPG style.
Yeah, it's in the style of, but
JRPGs have generally not progressed into that as much. I find like they have their own sort of specific 80-hour long text trees story that the director's trying to tell, sort of thing, compared to
Final Fantasy 15. Is Final Fantasy 15 a Western RPG? That feels dirty to say it. Because it is. It's how is it different than Skyrim?
Well,
I mean, obviously there's differences, but it's closer to Skyrim than Final Fantasy 7.
Is it? I haven't seen any gameplay, so I'm not really aware. I thought it was going to be similar to Final Fantasy
15.
Oh, 15, right? Yeah, I have played that. Well, it sort of is. Yeah, I guess it is sort of closer. It has more open world elements to it,
and it's more action. It's not turn based.
Yeah,
and you're driving a car on a highway, listening to music. That sounds very American. I mean,
yeah.
So if in style form, if we're not basing it on region, then Final Fantasy 15 is a Western RPG, but that feels really dirty to say.
Western style RPG.
Yeah. What's World of Warcraft? I mean, obviously it's an MMO. It's a Morpeg, right?
Yeah, but those are
multiplayer online RPG.
Right? Like, World of Warcraft is an MMO RPG.
Yeah, it is. And is it a West or is it Japanese? And if that's such, what about Final Fantasy 11 or 14? Is that Western or Japanese, or is it just a MMO RPG? Like, what makes it a Japanese or Western? Like, if you have a Western turn-based game that was just like Final Fantasy, which there were,
in a hypothetical world where everybody is not just throwing out these canned descriptions and canned genres and stuff, what would we like to see? How would we delineate between Fire Emblem, Final Fantasy, and a racing game, let's say, that has RPG elements? What would we say to replace that term?
In the casual setting, compare it. I mean, people shit on this, but GTA Final Fantasy or GTA like or roguelike, because that's a genre. Metroidvania, it's referencing other games to describe this game because every game is unique, sometimes very much so, and you have to use other games.
In favor of, rather than just putting a blanket RPG on something, going more the route of referencing prior games whose shoulders
that's casual. But if you're like being professional or you're trying to advertise your game, I think it'd be in bad taste to go, this is the game I just made. It's just like Metroid. I'm like, don't talk about other games. Talk about your game,
Yes, this is a Skyrim-like.
Yeah. So just describe what the mechanics are. If it's turn-based, say it's turn-based. If it's a character growth game, it's exploration, you can do that. If it's a music rhythm game with racing elements, fine, say that. I think that's the only way to describe a game now is what can the player expect to do in the game. That's the only thing I can say.
It is actually really frustrating. For someone like me, I am very picky about what games I am going to actually play and invest time in. And I know I like RPGs, but I don't really, because I only like a really specific type of RPG. And I honestly do wish there was some more descriptive text around a lot of these games, because I like a game that has that top-down ARPG sort of combat, simple combat, like a Diablo or something like that, where things are. I don't like something like Xenoblade Chronicles at all. I despise the content in that game, or the combat in that game, but I love Diablo and the combat in that game. And so I really wish that there was a little bit more descriptive text around the titles of these games, other than just saying ARPG, let's say.
But it's so hard to even describe. Like, how would you describe I might say it's a reactionary position system with preset algorithms for non-playable characters that you can swap between, so that it's well, how do you describe it? It's Xenoblade-esque. It's Xenoblade-like, it's something, and that's why demos have to exist, and video people actually explaining. One thing that's missing from video games, I've mentioned it before, I don't know if on the podcast, is game developers need to show more passion about what they make. Pick any movie, like virtually any movie, there's going to be a commentary on it about, I loved making this. This is the decisions we made. You get actors, you get the directors, you get people behind the scenes, and they're talking about what they love about it. You don't get that with games outside of Half-Life, Brother, Portal, a couple other games here and there. You might get a video. The early God of Wars had some of that. You unlock some things. The Dark Pictures anthology, that horror series, that the fourth one's just been announced. They have that. They talk about the passion of what a horror anthology is, what to expect from these games, what to do. But most of the time when you get a developer talking about something, there's going, you're going to love it. It's got a brand name that you already know. Look, it's Diablo on mobile phones. What? Why are you booing? Because no one knows what they're actually talking about. They're just spitting the name out and where it is. Video games are complex, and I feel and I understand why anyone outside of the hobby doesn't want to get in it. It's not inclusive. It really isn't. It is a very, very hard hobby to get into if you don't know a thing about it. You have to kind of be born into it. Or
even for those of us who are in it neck deep, some aspects of the gaming hobby, and particularly RPGs with the huge backlog of huge franchises and stuff, it can be really overwhelming and not particularly accessible. You have this thing where you don't want to play a game unless you can play every game in the series in order.
Yeah, that's
I have that sometimes with certain series too. I would love to be able to start at the beginning of the Atelier series back on the PS2 and grow with the series, because I find stepping into the most recent game, there are things that are not necessarily intuitive because I didn't grow with the series. But it's not necessarily all that accessible between all the different platforms that you have to buy games on, and the price of used games sometimes, or the availability of used games. Sometimes some of these games are really expensive, and it's just not practical to acquire every game in the series. So then you end up feeling kind of like maybe you just want to miss out on the whole thing because it's just not accessible.
Well, this isn't a topic for today, but I have a whole idea of how to revamp the whole world of copyright and distribution of things, because I think it's really disgusting that I can go on Pirate Bay and download so much anything I wanted to, but there's no other way for me to get these things. Like you said, how are you going to get a PS2 Atelier game if no one's selling it, or you can't afford it because it's so rare, but you can't get it on another system or anything else? And then you get these games that are so confusing, because if you look at a game, you never know who made it. Like when I was a kid, I thought Nintendo made Final Fantasy because they published it, and nowhere on the box did it really say Square, because Square wasn't a big enough company to matter. And that happens all the time. Like you see Square on Tomb Raider, but they didn't make it. It was Crystal Dynamics, and their name's on the cover too, but it's not the big name. The developers mean nothing. It's the publishers apparently, and you never know. So, and even back then, you don't even know who owns half the games half the time to even release it on the Switch. Like if Nintendo wanted to put every Nintendo game on the Switch and they had the money to pay off everyone, they still wouldn't be able to do it because they don't know who owns what, right?
So before we wrap up for the night, I would love to hear maybe everybody's opinions on what would be your favorite RPG that you're playing right now, or that you intend to play pretty soon, whether it's old or modern. Just give me some favorites, something you're looking forward to playing, or something you're currently playing.
Well, if we're going to use a traditional word RPG, I guess it's Octopath Traveler. I need to finish that. That's very traditional, what I grew up with and it's just kind of boring and a lot of grindy, and the story, all the elements are great individually, but put together it's kind of trash. But that's mine. Yeah.
Pory?
I mean, I've been playing Pokemon Brilliant Diamond, and I do hope to start off with Paper Mario: The Origami King.
Tell me about that. I want to hear about that when you play it. I want to hear what you think.
Yeah, I will.
So for me, a couple of games that I started playing and got a significant way into and then got distracted are Final Fantasy XII, The Zodiac Age, which I'm absolutely in love with, and Trials of Mana. Both games I'm absolutely in love with and definitely want to get back to here in the new year. I've just been so distracted with all the new games coming out this year, and I'm finally getting to a place where I'm ready to start stepping back into those games over the holidays here. So Final Fantasy XII has a really interesting combat system that was controversial back in the day, but for some reason now it feels a lot more natural, I think, than it did back then, mostly because I'm familiar with MMO combat now, whereas back then in the PS2 era, people hadn't played as many MMOs. So I don't know, it feels very intuitive now. I absolutely love the game, but it was not a popular choice back in the day. So
people that tried it and gave it a chance ended up liking a lot. It almost became my favorite Final Fantasy, but then 3/4 of the way through, it kind of lost its way with me. I think it's because they changed directors.
And Kaz, I mean, outside of that Skyrim Anniversary Edition that you just picked up, is there anything else you want to mention?
Well, as Pory said, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, I'm also playing and really enjoying. But I'm also playing another tabletop RPG on another night of the week called Pathfinder, which is basically Dungeons and Dragons 3.5 edition, but not called Dungeons and Dragons because D&D moved on to their 4th edition. Everybody hated it, so they just created Pathfinder. And I'm really enjoying it. It's a lot more in depth compared to 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, and it's just really interesting. In my latest game, I had my character. He's like a 3-foot tall gnome. The party kind of got onto like a rowboat, and then one of the other characters used a spell to like launch it like a motorboat. It launched onto this giant pirate ship, crushing and killing like 3 pirates. And then as my character tried to run onto the other ship that the pirate ship had like been boarding, he fell off into the water, failed his swim check. So he like started to drown. And so this other character who's like a summoner spellcaster, he like had these giant octopuses that or octopi like grabbed my character out of the water. My character just like freaked out. He had no idea what was going on, and now he has a phobia of tentacles. But it was, that's the sort of thing that you wouldn't get out of a video game RPG.
Of course.
And honestly, I don't even know if I could even if we'd get that out of the current edition of D&D, just because of how sort of simplistic it is to be made for that sort of entry level tabletop RPG for today.
So I'm gonna have to wrap us up here. I've got a pizza coming to the door in the next couple of minutes. Don't look at me like that.
I am giving you that look.
So thanks so much for sticking around with us tonight. Thanks for being on again tonight, guys. It was an interesting topic, and I'd like to see the conversation continue, maybe on Twitter or Instagram or something, throughout the week. See if we can get some engagement and, maybe some opinions from the public out there, and then maybe report back next week and just see if we have any updates at all. So if you're listening out there, feel free to connect with us any of a dozen different ways, whether it's on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, or whether you reach out to us in the comments of the YouTube video or on the VOD on Twitch, or wherever you want to catch up with us, please do.
All the options.
Comment, and we will be happy to interact with you. So thanks so much, guys. This has been episode 22, and we will see you next week.